Hello and welcome to Asian Insider. I'm Ravi Veloor, and my guest today is Mr. Chandran Nair, the Hong Kong based founder and chief executive of GIFT, which is short for Global Institute for Tomorrow. Today, we're going to discuss India's disastrous environmental situation and to ask the question, can the country draw from China's development expertise to improve things for itself? Mr. Nair is an environmental engineer with deep experience in China. Back in 1994, he established the first foreign consultancy in China, and he continues to be a regular visitor there ever since. He also travels frequently to India, from where his parents migrated to Malaysia before the Second World War. That makes him a perfect person to speak on the subject, and especially since I managed to reach him in China for this podcast. So, welcome to Asian Insider, Mr. Chandran Nair.
Ravi, thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure to speak to you and hopefully share a few ideas and thoughts.
Now, could you give me a sense of what China was like when you first got there?
Yeah, I mean, and, I also want to just maybe clear that, there are other people who were in China and saw China in the 80s as well as foreigners. But when I went to China in 1990 and coming from Southeast Asia, Chinese people are not alien to me. So we were brought up with Chinese people in Malaysia, etc. But in Africa, I met Chinese from China who were actually supporting the liberation struggles. China didn't have boots on the ground, but China was providing a lot of aid, medical, nurses, medical officers, doctors, and other types of support. So I was very interested in what China was doing, despite at that point China still being very poor. So when I landed in Hong Kong, I went to China. I was really fascinated by what was going on. Even in 1990, I always tell the story of going and staying at the Beijing hotel, and you didn't even get your own key. It was a very different place. There wasn't hot water in the rooms. I had a spittoon under my bed and all of that.
Yeah.
But I was fascinated, but it was very polluted. There were hardly many cars and lots of bicycles. People were very poor.
Sure.
But I could see a sense that something was changing rapidly. And so I started to get interested. And that after 4 years, managed to find a way to open the first international environmental consulting firm in China with support from one or two very senior Chinese government officials. And when I met them, they were asking me questions that today I realize that they had a vision of what China should be, but they knew it would take 2 or 3 decades to actually fulfill.
Right.
So yes, it was a very poor country then.
Right. I first went to China in 2004. That's about 10 years after you set up your consulting firm. Now, the air used to be very bad.
Yeah.
My colleagues in China were writing about foaming lakes and so forth because of chemicals dumped in the water. And, the Beijing sunsets used to be spectacular because of light refracting of the pollution particles in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Now, can you trace for me China's journey from most polluted nation on earth to where it is today?
Well, thank you for saying, what you observed in 2004. And in 2000 and around 2000, in the start of this century, the international media, as part of the geopolitical sort of, demonization of China, as you will know, was making out that China was a catastrophe and everything was going to be very bad. But clearly, in the work we were doing as consultants, mainly working for multinational companies, etc., I was getting a bit of an insight into also what policymakers in China were having to deal with. It was very clear that the scale of the problem was one that no other country had ever encountered in terms of the scale of what was going on. We were doing some of the due diligence and some of the big M&A deals when foreign companies, Europeans, Americans, are coming in buying out. And they had due diligence procedures that required them to identify all the environmental liabilities. And so from that point, I could see what the real scale of the problem was. And even me, with my knowledge at that time, felt this was an insurmountable problem that would take a huge amount of time for any country to overcome. And then I began to notice around 2005, as China began to bid for the Olympics, and I was in Beijing in Tiananmen Square on the night that China was awarded the Olympics, and we could begin to see change that was beginning to take place. And China used the Olympics and, dare I say, the criticism that it got until the day of the Olympics, that it was not going to be a success, was all going to be polluted, as motivation to also prove that it could get this done. So the Olympics served as a catalyst for mobilization, but
Mm-hmm.
also experimentation with large scale policies. And we can talk about why other countries, and I know you perhaps want to talk about India,
Mm-hmm.
why
We'll come to that
India,
in a bit. Yeah.
yeah, can't
Yeah.
perhaps do that. But it was the ability of the state to essentially exercise its resources in a way that could essentially take collective interests
Mm-hmm.
and put it at the forefront, the sort of communitarian interest, forefront of private interests, etc.
Right.
And then starting from about 2006 onwards for the next 10 years, China worked relentless at it, and particularly through also the scientific knowledge and the engineering capabilities that it was able to mobilize. So there's policy, there's engineering, there's science, and the ability to mobilize society as well. So that's the journey. And today we know where China stands, both in terms of EV, electric vehicles, renewable energies, and to your point about the Beijing, the river, the stream and river, people are swimming in it, and they will start swimming in it in a few weeks in summer. 15 years ago, that was a polluted mess.
Right. No, but can you tell me about a few specific steps that the Chinese authorities took to clean up their act, so to speak?
I think the most important thing that Chinese were able to do, which is a reflection of the political system, was to make decisive steps to move certain very polluting industries. There was no negotiations, it was dictates, because the scale of the problem is so large. Many of these were also state owned enterprises, so the government had the power, but they also took the risk in terms of displacement of people. I mean, you have to understand, some of the state owned enterprises employed about 60,000 people and all of that. So I remember one which was a large electric company manufacturing electric appliances, lighting, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
60,000 people completely moved,
Right.
right? And then the steel mills, etc. So that's the first one.
Right.
The second was essentially beginning to put in place the infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
that enabled people's mobility to be the issue of mobility to be addressed, but also planning ahead in terms of therefore bringing about clean vehicles and all of that. So it was the ability to essentially mobilize the resources and put in place very, very difficult policies, which in most countries are almost impossible to do. And I was just talking to an American friend of mine, in terms of the high speed railway network, in 25 years, China has built more high speed railway networks than the entire world combined. The
Absolutely.
United States has not been able to build one high speed railway track, mainly because the political system does not allow it to do so and
Mm-hmm.
make decisions.
Right. So arresting the degradation is one thing, but China seems to have actually improved in certain areas, including reforestation in some parts of the country. How much of that is true?
Oh, it's very, very true. Um, Actually, the reforestation program goes back to the 60s. In my book, which addresses this issue not just of China, but what I call the sustainable state, I argue this is about 7 years old, but I argue that in the 21st century, the challenge of what is loosely called sustainable development will be the most profound political economic challenge for all nations, particularly the large countries of the developing world. And to do that, we would need a very strong state. And therein lies the more controversial discussion about democracy as is practiced in, say, Western liberal democracies and other countries, the previously colonized countries who've adopted
Mhm.
the same model, and the
Mhm.
inability to execute because of the consultation processes, etc.
Mhm.
And I argued that that we would have to do something very differently. So in that book, in the first chapter, I provide a case study of a province in China where the desert was being converted into green areas starting in the 1960s. And I actually been there, worked on a project there, etc., to see how people were given land. And it was not about money. The Chinese government was able to essentially mobilize the populace and then do land reform and give them access to the land through the planting trees. But it was 20 years of hard work, and that again is a political system that helps do that. So China has grown the largest amount. I mean, there can be criticism about the monocultures, etc. But if you look at the cities, and I was in Hangzhou yesterday only, you'd be amazed. It's a bit like Singapore, but Singapore is small. But every square inch of every available public space is a tree.
It's a
Uh,
tree.
is free everywhere.
That's fascinating. Can we talk about India? I understand that you do travel there quite frequently.
Yes. So, of course, being of Indian origin, I've been very interested in, and because India is also, large like China. I joke, who cares what happens in Australia? It's like 25 million people. They all fit into Chongqing or Madras or Mumbai, or even, my country, Malaysia, which is beautiful, but it's small. India and China matter. Indonesia matters. All of these countries, and that's the essence of the book. And my point, coming to your question about India and the scale of the problem, and my thesis is that India is probably the country that's faced is most threatened by the convergence of the existential threats that we are
Hmm.
faced with,
Right.
right? And I've said this for a long time.
Hmm.
And so India, as you know, has one third of the landmass of China. Its arable land is quite comparable. Its population is now going to exceed that of China, etc. And going there frequently, we've all talked about the new India, etc. But the new India is an India that is defined by the traditional metrics of exports and all of this, and the
Hmm.
GDP
Hmm.
per capita GDP. India
Hmm.
is still pretty low compared to China.
Hmm.
So, in terms of the environment, India sadly is so far behind.
Right. I
Uh,
heard some ghastly, I saw some ghastly data that suggested that about 5,000 Indians die every day as a direct result of the poor air quality. I don't know if those stats are true, but they did seem quite frightening.
those stats are not exaggerated. I mean, one needs to verify some of this, but anybody can go and check the WHO website, etc. But the scenario is pretty disastrous. When we go back and look at 15, 20 years ago, China had some of the most polluted cities in the world in terms of air quality. Today, India outranks the whole world in terms of the most amount of polluted cities for air quality.
Right.
But it's also important to understand that we limit, quite often people talk about air quality. Water quality in India is terrible
Right.
as well, and
Yes.
mainly because of sewage systems and all of that not being in place. If you went to China 20 years ago and you saw the toilets, we'd all joke, you just don't go, right? Today, you can go to toilets in small towns in China and even airports, and they're Star Trek. You can smell the Dettol a kilometer away.
I see.
Uh, Toilet cleaners have metrics like 3 flies and you're out.
Oh, my
I mean,
goodness.
all of these sorts of very stringent conditions to improve it. Water quality in Chinese rivers have improved tremendously. This is not to say there's not a lot more work to be done. But if you look at the main rivers in India, the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, and all of those, water quality is not improved. They have
Mm,
got worse.
mm,
In fact, because of the population,
yeah.
industrialization, etc.
Mm,
So it's not simply about air quality, it's water,
yes.
it's soil degradation,
Mm,
and not to mention the sort of impact on the
mm,
most disenfranchised large amounts of the population.
mm.
Now, even as I say these things, and I imagine you have Indian audiences listening to this, and I've spoken in India about this, immediately there is a reaction, particularly from middle class elite Indians. And I think they are part of the problem, that they have essentially desensitized themselves
Mm.
to the tragedy of the commons that has
Yeah,
taken
no,
place.
I was going to come to that in a moment. But, India is so focused on growth. And even there, I heard the Harvard professor, economist Gita Gopinath, who used to be, I think, the number two in the IMF not too long ago, say that India's growth potential is being held back by the poor air quality, that the environment is causing more damage to the economy than Donald Trump's tariffs. Do you agree?
It's well for people like her to say those things, and at one level she's absolutely right, but at the same time the growth models, etc., that India have adopted are the same ones exported by the IMF and the World Bank, uh, and all of them. So there is a contradiction in terms of saying you need to clean up, but at the same time pushing growth numbers which do not sit comfortably with the stage at which countries are able to develop. So that's a much longer discussion. There is no doubt that when you have severe pollution like the ones you had like you have in India, it will retard your growth numbers. But let's not forget as well that the GDP growth does not, in fact, take into account pollution, etc.
It
And
does
so,
not.
when many of these countries are now put their GDP growth, which is where they get their rankings in terms of what the World Bank and the IMF, etc., say,
Right,
pollution is not counted for at all.
right.
So, yeah, she's right, but she's also slightly,
Hmm.
what can I say, missing the point
Right.
that you're pushing growth models that are essentially unsustainable. Let me just say that China did have the same problem. It was affecting its growth, but its GDP continued to grow. But the damage was much more widespread and not accounted for in GDP growth. But the
That's right.
Chinese recognized that and decided to essentially
Right.
take action.
So, as you just said, the Chinese recognized that things needed to be fixed and they went ahead and tried to do it. What lessons do you think India can learn from the Chinese experience?
There are lots of lessons to be learned in terms of what to do, and in terms of the ability of the state to be extremely omnipresent, the state to be draconian in some of its measures. As a Singaporean, I think you will understand that draconian is not necessarily a bad word, but sometimes the state has to be omnipresent and it has to take very tough long-term measures, etc., and leave aside the interest of those with private interests, etc., and tough.
Mhm.
Now, that's what the Chinese were able to do.
Hmm.
The problem for India, it's political. So there's lots of lessons. It can listen, it can copy, it can look at. The problem is implementation, and the problem of implementation in India is the institutions are weak, and democracy. I've argued this does not sit comfortably with the need to make long-term decisions that have implications on what people think of as, particularly those with vested interests,
Mhm.
as their rights to grow.
Mhm.
So the fundamental difference is the Chinese political economy and the system allows it to do things that a so-called liberal democracy like India is unable to do. But
Mhm.
then we can define what is a liberal democracy and what isn't. And I would argue if outcomes are the things by which you measure results, then India is perhaps not really a democracy because it's not able to get the outcomes that should fulfill the outcome, the sort of results that you want from good governance, which is supposedly why people say democracy is worthwhile pursuing in that form. So
Right. I know that some Indians will resent my next question, Chandran, and I know that you have been called a panda hugger and so forth. But can
I'm an elephant
China,
hugger, actually.
I beg your pardon, you're an elephant hugger, and so am
Oh yeah.
I. I love my elephants too. But can China help India fix its bad air and water? Are there things that the Chinese can do to help? After all, it benefits them as well because bad air anywhere in the world travels because winds bring it to you sooner or later.
I mean, it's a good question in the sense that I mean, you know as well as I do that India is not lacking in scientific capability.
Yeah, that's going to
It's
be my
not,
next question. Actually, you
yeah, it's
anticipated it.
not
Yes.
lacking in technological capabilities. In many areas, it is behind China, but it has the scientists, it has the knowledge. So, can China help maybe with some of the advanced technology because it had a head start? It's a large country, etc. But I don't think anyone can help India. Only India can help itself. And that is because it's a political issue. So I've long stated that sustainability is essentially about political objectives. And a lot of people misconstrue this and they think it's something to do with the environment, etc.
Hmm.
The challenges we face
Hmm.
in terms of what's called, whether it's climate change, whether it's called air pollution, whether it's hazardous waste, it's an outcome of the economic policies
Hmm.
we pursue.
Hmm.
Our economic policies worldwide today are essentially at war. And this, I'm not a green hugger, panda hugger, or a member of Greenpeace, but it's science and acceptance of macroeconomic realities. The economic model that we have pursued for the last 50, 60 years and pushed relentlessly is essentially at war with planetary constraints
Hmm.
and people.
Hmm.
We have to do it differently. The Chinese understood that much earlier,
Hmm.
and now they're struggling with it, but they are
Hmm.
using technology, also the ability to organize to handle it in their own country. Now, the Chinese can't do anything in India. The Indian government has to be able to have a system of governance that allows it to enforce
Right. But as you
rules
just
and
pointed
move
out,
fast.
India does have wonderful satellite technology. It has great agricultural scientists who have actually
Yeah,
developed wonderful rice strains and maybe wheat
yes.
strains that consume less water and all that. But why is it not able to tap into this wonderful pool of expertise to help itself?
Well, fundamentally, because these questions, these problems, the solutions to these problems are not technological problems. The technology exists, so you have the technology. The question is a political problem. And the reason to answer your question that India has not been able to is because the political system does not allow for an impartial assessment of these issues and to bring the best minds together. In a way, if I could use the word, it's corrupt. Just like the United States financial system is a corrupt system, and right now it's essentially also militarized to the point of view it's corrupt.
Hmm.
The Indian political system, in
Hmm.
terms of dealing with these economic issues, is corrupt, it's weak.
Hmm.
So it's not a technology problem. The best Indians are all there. I
Hmm.
know some of them, some of the best scientists, but they are marginalized by the political system and the vested interests of big business. Large Indian businesses, not all, many are good, like companies like Tata, etc. But many are essentially running roughshod about rules, etc., because the system is corrupt. And today in China is not free of corruption, but environmental regulations and infringement, the punishments are severe,
Severe, yes.
severe.
Do you think India could do better about pricing its precious resources, such as water, properly to minimize the waste? Uh, for instance, I know that many politicians like to announce free power to farmers, but it is my understanding that the farmer does not want free power. so much as assured power.
Exactly. So the question of pricing our consumption of goods and services, and I'm not trying to mention another book of mine, but my
Mhm.
first book is about consumption.
Mhm.
And the problem we have today worldwide, and I mentioned the sort of liberal neo-economic model,
Mhm.
is that the entire economic model is premised on pursuing overconsumption by underpricing resources and access to resources. So when you mention water, water has always been underpriced. And it's not a question of pricing it out of the reach of the poorer people because you can do differential tiered pricing, etc. These are more complicated governance and economic issues. But you have to price it properly because otherwise you abuse it. So you're right to say that it's not about free power. It's even in my country, in Malaysia, you know, the economists in the country know that subsidies for petrol and gasoline is not in the interest of the country or also in the interest of the long-term sustainability of the lower income groups, etc. So it's pricing it properly so that people use it
Mhm.
judiciously,
Mhm.
and then the government using the revenues from proper pricing and taxation
Mhm.
to create the equity that one needs. So in
Mhm.
India too, I would argue that the first thing to do when it comes to water is you have to mandate sewerage systems, and then you start pricing for water discharges, water usage, and industrial water use. It's not just in India, across the world, particularly in Asia, Africa, is totally underpriced and illegally used. One of the most water stressed countries in the world is Pakistan. And Pakistan is not a small country, it'll peak at about maybe 350 million to 400 million people, is one of the most water stressed because a lot of groundwater has been used. And farming in Pakistan will come under increasing stress as groundwater aquifers start to diminish. So in India, it's the same thing. You have to price, but it comes back to strong institutions, governance, rule of law.
Mhm.
And I hate to say it, but Indians have been desensitized to the lack of rule of law,
Mhm.
in particularly in protecting public goods and common goods. And
Mhm.
this is the failure. And
Right.
that's changed, coming back to your point about China, a lot more work to be done. But those protections are now there, pricing is in, and they're using technology in many ways to ensure that it becomes a lot stricter and monitoring is carried out all the time.
Can you give me a couple of examples?
Well, for instance, in places where water is scarce, there's a pricing mechanism for water, so everyone is charged for for the water use. And what they've also done is start and put in place, even in small towns, to protect rivers, etc., sewage systems. Towns which are 1,000 kilometers away from Beijing. In the last 20 years, sewage systems put in, and everyone has to pay a rate charge for all of these things. So
Mhm.
this is the behavioral change that you begin to see in societies where the pricing mechanism begins to be put in place, and that's what in many ways transforms Singapore too. One
Mhm.
area that is not discussed a lot is the nightmare of urban of solid waste management, which in India is now completely out of control in many areas, which has health consequences, river consequences on waterways, etc. In many ways, there too, you have to start putting in the infrastructure and then pricing it. I'm just going through Shanghai. I was in Hangzhou. I was in Beijing, and I was in a small town. You hardly see any litter anymore in any Chinese streets. And this is a country with 1 billion people. What happened is pricing, enforcement, education, monitoring changed behaviors in the space of 10 years.
How
And that's
interesting.
what needs to happen in places like India. But you
Right.
start putting the infrastructure, pricing things properly,
Right.
and then enforcement.
Right. I've been writing for a few years about the need to refashion capitalism or, maybe even fix the current model with its huge stress and consumption. Do you think one way out for India is to lay less stress on this GDP growth number fixation and accept fewer cars and bikes on the road and more public transport and so forth?
Absolutely. In fact, when my first book came out, I was interviewed on Hard Talk, and the person they brought to argue the case for against my argument about liberal neoliberal economics was the Reserve Bank head of India, Raghunath. I forget his
Rajan.
surname, Raghunath Rajan.
Yeah.
And because he is so much in that system, he couldn't quite understand the argument that I was making. But fortunately, the host understood it, that we would need to curb the rights of people to certain types of excesses that essentially in large urban areas create gross pollution that therefore affect everybody else. And one of the things I said is car ownership is not a human right. But all governments think that you need to have a car industry and flood the cities and the roads with cars to have development, because the old theory is that industrialization is kickstarted by having the automotive industry. It's a complete disaster now. But you could do different things with the essentially public transport system. So I've argued that we need to price these things in ways that would help public transport systems be developed. And in a small way, you can look at what Singapore has done, but through road pricing, is essentially taxed the privilege of private car ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially fundamentally the only choice we have. And
Mm-hmm.
so in countries like India, a completely remodeled way of looking at how do you create prosperity rather than think about growth is essentially the essence of how we need to look at the next 25 years of the 21st century, because we will have 10 billion people. And the current trajectory is not going to be reversed unless we reverse our complete ideas about what is prosperity, what is growth, and what do people in large developing countries have as basic rights.
Right. Chandran Nair, that was a really insightful conversation, and thank you so much for coming on Asian Insider.
Thank you for having me and allowing me to kind of explain some complex thoughts in a short time.
You're most welcome. And that's a wrap for Asian Insider. I'm Ravi Veloor. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. And if you'd like to read my articles, we have links in our podcast show notes below. You can also sign up for our Asian Insider newsletter. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Thank you for joining us.